This is Duke University.
Joining us from Cairo is Matt Bradley, and we are going to be talking to him about the recent events and in Egypt. So thanks for joining us. Let me begin by just talking about perhaps the general atmosphere today in Cairo, everyday life in the street. How does it feel to be there?
Well, actually, right now the atmosphere in Cairo is ebullient. Everybody is celebrating the passage of the Constitution. By about 97% of the voters voted in favor of the Constitution here in Egypt. And the turnout was about 38% for this referendum on the new Constitution. So if you're going by just how the public mood is, everybody is extremely happy, extremely pleased, and they're moving forward with what they consider to be a new stage in Egypt's democratic transition. However, from another perspective, from the perspective of some of the Islamists, mostly Islamists who supported Mohamed Morsi and others, many of the revolutionaries who were down in Tahrir Square for the 18 days before President Mubarak was ousted in 2011, this is a real disaster because the Constitution was drafted under circumstances that many people feel were undemocratic. And those who were protesting against the Constitution and urging people to go and vote no, many of them, or some of them, there were very few people who were urging anyone to go vote no, but at least 7 of them were arrested and detained for a brief period of time. So, and there was really no real move to try to embrace any sort of dissent or criticism of this interim military-backed government. So, well, if you were to talk to people, you would get the feeling that that Egypt is sort of democracy on the march here. At the same time, there is a very silent but rather large minority of people who are very upset with what's been going on here, and they feel that this is a reversal of the revolutionary gains that happened in 2011.
So given this like two contradictory feelings, like the very repressive environment in which the vote took place, the crackdown on opposition, and this kind of popular enthusiasm, at least on parts of some of the populations, how do you reconcile these two pictures? What do they tell us about what's going on in Egypt today?
Well, it's a very difficult moment. Because what we're seeing right now, at least in the eyes of many of the revolutionaries, many of the Islamists, and many members of the foreign media here, this looks like a rollback of the revolution in 2011. But to many Egyptians, this looks like another stage in a 3-year-long revolution. This looks like a step towards democracy. And you start hearing, before President Morsi was elected last year, you heard people discuss the Muslim Brotherhood as just another ordinary political force, the most organized, most powerful political force in Egypt, and they batted 1,000 every time they went to elections, whether they had a position on a referendum, whether they were putting up parliamentary candidates for a parliamentary election, whether they were running for president, they always won. The Islamists were dominating throughout the entire last 3 years, and it was only recently, only 6 months ago, when we started to see these people getting pushed aside, and there was a massive outpouring of anger against the Islamists and against Mohamed Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood. And that's when we started to hear a totally different dialogue emerging from this new political paradigm, in which we started talking about the Muslim Brotherhood as terrorists. People were referring to them as theocratic chauvinists, people who wanted to create a theocracy in Egypt that would dominate and that would suppress women, would suppress the Coptic minority here, that would try to impose some sort of Islamist state. Now, this has all been a very effective propaganda rollout. We've seen it on the private television stations, on the public television stations, and on the newspapers, both privately and publicly owned. Throughout the entire country, this dialogue has really come to the fore in a very strong way. And it's convinced quite a few people. So we can't, when we're talking about reconciling this difference of opinion, it's almost impossible to do that because to dissent, to criticize, has effectively been made illegal in Egypt. And that's why it looks very much like the old dichotomy that defined Egypt before the revolution in 2011, in which you had a military-backed government with the face being President Hosni Mubarak, versus an Islamist-dominated opposition who were trying to use democratic reforms as a means of reaching power. So this is not this whole system right now is just that dichotomy back again. Whereas a lot of the revolutionaries who were in Tahrir Square in January and February 2011, they considered themselves to be secularists, to be leftists, liberals, people who were opposed to both the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists and the military-backed regime. Those people have been on the back foot for the last 3 years, and their voices are still not being heard, and many of them are being rearrested and put back in jail.
So this is clearly, I mean, a backward step as far as a democratic change in Egypt, and it's hard not to make the comparison with what's happened in Tunisia just like the same week, that Tunisia just voted for a relatively liberal, progressive constitution. So how do we explain what is happening to the secular, liberal, or nationalist forces in Egypt, where some of the nationalist forces might be part of the change? I mean, they are condoning the military takeover, basically. How do we explain this? I mean, what is it about what's going on, have been going on in Egypt since the collapse of Mubarak's regime that's really changed the path of change in the country?
It's very difficult to explain, and in fact, it's very difficult for any observer of Egypt to explain what has gone on in the last 3 years. Now, one of the easiest ways to look at it is simply that there was a revolution that was led, or rather instigated, by secular, liberal protesters, mostly young, mostly middle class, upper middle class, somewhat educated. And they managed to create an environment that led to mass protest, where they took advantage of the toppling of Ben Ali in Tunisia and instigated a mass protest against Mubarak, toppled him, and then tried to craft a modern democratic system out of what remained.
So what happened to them? Sorry.
And the Islamists came in and dominated that system. And this is the easiest way of looking at it. The Islamists came in and dominated that system because the liberal leftist activist class who had toppled Mubarak were simply incapable of getting themselves elected. They had no local roots. They had no feelers out in the society beyond the Tahrir Square, where they had agitated for revolution and agitated to get Mubarak toppled. And so the Islamists dominated. Even as the leftists and liberals continued to protest against the military dominance of the government, the Islamists won every single election that happened. And so, as I said, this is the easiest way to look at it. The secularists decided that they were going to basically collude with the military and with some of the sort of old regime forces to topple the Islamists and kind of bring back the former regime.
So is there some kind of like a regret? I mean, the day after now we see that the aura of the strong man, the savior of Egypt is back. We see pictures of General Sissi everywhere in the street. It's a reworking of the same military, basically autocratic regime back to power. I mean, what happened to this? I mean, they were so fragile, these liberal secular forces, so just as to dissipate, or they are still in agreement with the military just to get rid of the Islamists. I mean, looking at the constitution, it didn't really change much in terms of like reference to Islam or the Islamic sources, or I didn't see the new text. However, I can't imagine, I don't see how different it is from the old one. So the justification for lining up or joining the military is very dubious to me.
The new constitution is very similar to the constitution that was drafted and passed under Mohammed Morsi. And that constitution was in fact very similar to the one that was drafted and passed in the early 1970s by the Mubarak or by the Sadat regime. So there, really, it's the same old story unfolding here in Egypt. And that's why I say that it's the return of the former regime. Now, if you were to talk to Egyptians, many of them would disagree. Many of them would say that we had a revolution against Mubarak, and then we had another revolution against the Islamists, and now we're on the path to democracy. Now, that's an argument worth making. Perhaps they have managed to topple a theocratic regime, or one that they thought was theocratic. But the fact of the matter is that the Morsi presidency never pursued any decidedly Islamic legislation during the year that they were in office. And the parliament that was dominated by Islamists, and by the tune of 77% Islamists, including Salafis, who were even more conservative than the Muslim Brotherhood, they never really proposed any seriously Islamist legislation. So the argument that there was a theocracy in the making, and that the Muslim Brotherhood was trying to impose an Islamist state on a population of Egyptians that is mostly sort of Sufi Islamic and very moderate in their understanding of Islam, that argument is rather moot. It's rather specious because there hasn't been any evidence of any real Islamist strides by Morsi or by the parliament that was dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis.
Okay, so I imagine, that Sissi is going to run for presidential election and probably he's going to win. Do we know who he is? Who are his closest associates? How is he going to build consensus? Do we have any sense of where he comes from?
Well, we know that Sissi is a military general. And like most Egyptian military generals, to get to the rank that he achieved, you would have to have had a fairly significant period of time, several years of study in the United States. So he was a military general who studied tactics and field work in the United States for several years. And so we know that about him. We know that he, or at least it was suspected at the time that Morsi basically elevated him from the mid-ranks of the highest level of the military, which is called the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, that there was a lot of talk that Sissi was an Islamist. And that's probably not as true as it seemed at the time last summer when Morsi cast aside General Tantawi, who was the former head of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, and elevated Sissi to the head of the defense minister position. We know that there's talk that his wife is veiled, wears the hijab, and that his daughter, and I can't comment on this for certain, that his daughter wears the niqab, which is an even more conservative form of Islamic dress. So there is reason to believe that he has Islamist sympathies. But in the new Egypt, Islamist sympathies doesn't really matter in terms of your politics, because the Muslim Brotherhood is seen as a pernicious political force rather than just an ideology. It's seen as a fifth column. So it's detested not so much for its beliefs, and its moderate Islamist beliefs would really be shared by a large part of the Egyptian population. It's seen as suspicious because it's so well organized, and because it's thought to have connections with more than 70 branches of the Muslim Brotherhood throughout different Islamic countries. So that's why it's seen as suspicious.
Okay.
And so what we know about Sissi is basically that he is a man who has stood up to the Muslim Brotherhood, and the public feels extremely indebted to him for doing that, and are almost going to be giving him a carte blanche, similar to the way that Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s and 60s enjoyed sky-high popularity. And that was why he was able to implement some very, very profound changes to Egypt's economy, to its social system, to the stature of the military and society. When you have that kind of love from the population, you can do quite a bit.
Okay, the military seems to be proceeding with a lot of confidence. I mean, given the challenges, the social and economic challenges that Egypt is going to be facing, unemployment, social issues, and they don't seem to be too worried about how the United States or the West in general feels about the whole thing. Is Saudi Arabia providing a lot of support? I mean, is that aid coming from Saudi Arabia encouraging the military's political behavior?
Well, this has always been the case with Egypt for the past 3 years, ever since the revolution. There's this feeling among Egyptian policymakers and among Egyptian diplomats and that Egypt is sort of too big to fail. And we remember that turn of phrase from the financial crisis in the U.S. when the banks would sort of operated under the belief in a way, or there was this supposed belief that these banks, airlines, different large corporations, car manufacturers were too big to fail. And Egypt is the largest of all of the Arab countries. It is considered the beating heart of the Arab world. And many think that the United States in particular would never allow the Egyptian government or the Egyptian nation to fall into chaos because, frankly, that would endanger Israel, which shares a border with Egypt to Egypt's east. So the Egyptian military and Egyptian policymakers have long been working under this assumption. Now, that assumption has been reinforced even more by what you mentioned, by the support of Gulf countries to Egypt. And the Egyptian government has received some $12 billion in gifts from Gulf countries the moment that Morsi was deposed. Now, this was the strongest, most visible expression of the satisfaction that these Gulf countries had with Morsi's toppling. Now, why were they so happy that Morsi was pushed aside? It was because they were afraid that Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood, and again, the suspicion that I mentioned earlier of the Muslim Brotherhood is a fifth column, they were worried that Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood would empower radical Islamist elements in their own countries. So that's why we saw the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait rewarding the Egyptian public and the Egyptian military with their stalwart defense of secularism when they pushed aside Mohammed Morsi. Even though these countries, these Gulf countries, are hardly secular, they were just suspicious for political reasons of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so General Sissi and other policymakers in Egypt rightfully believe that these countries will not allow Egypt to fail and will not allow Egypt to fall back to the Islamist rule that it experienced for a year that ended in July.
Okay, well, we have a historical precedent in Algeria in 1991. The Islamic Salvation Front won the local and legislative elections. Then the military intervened and arrested the Islamist leader, and the whole democratic process was suspended. Well, we know what happened after that. I mean, the 5 or 7 years of civil war where hundreds of thousands of people died. Is that a possible scenario? Do we see that we might be moving towards some civil strife in Egypt in the years ahead?
It's a very apt comparison, and one that a lot of people, a lot of analysts and observers of Egypt make very frequently. However, it's hard to know. I'm not as familiar with Algerian history as I am with Egyptian history. I think that when we talk about the comparison, we need to realize that the support for Mr. Morsi's ouster has been overwhelming, that there has been a huge outpouring of support for Morsi's removal, and that the dragnet of police forces rounding up Muslim Brotherhood protesters and Muslim Brotherhood leaders has been rather successful up to this point and has broached very little criticism or resistance from the Egyptian public. So right now, the Muslim Brotherhood is almost completely, its back is basically broken at this point. And this was a similar move that Gamal Abdel Nasser did in the 1950s when he went and rounded up tens of thousands of Muslim Brotherhood members and leaders and threw them into jail. They were released later by Anwar Sadat. But this comparison with Algeria, I think, while it's apt and while it has a lot of parallels, we have to remember that the overwhelming portion of the Egyptian population is against the Muslim Brotherhood at this moment.
Okay, great. Okay, so last question. So what is in the political agenda? What's coming next in the next few months or this coming year?
Well, probably within the next few days, we're going to hear when parliamentary elections will be held and when presidential elections will be held. And around that time, when we hear this, and I said within the next few days, we're probably also going to hear whether or not General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is what the Muslim Brotherhood would describe as the lead putschist and who we've been discussing as the man who cast aside Morsi, we're going to hear whether or not he's running for president, and that would be a game changer. Because as you mentioned, if he decides to run for president, he's probably going to win. And he's probably going to have such a huge mandate that he will be able to dominate Egyptian politics. And that will essentially return the country to the kind of strongman rule that it's rarely ever not known. So if General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi does decide to run, he will probably be in a position to move Egypt into this sort of Mubarak era or Gamal Abdel Nasser era that it saw over the past several generations.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Appreciate it.